hole in that presentation that might cause you issues as you seek to address these things in the future in your own ministry to those around you, whether it be your ministry to your family as a father, answering your children's questions, your neighbors, friends, relatives, whatever else it might be. And so we will do that in the Sunday school hour, and I will try to let you know when that will be. Now, again, beginning at verse 10 of Leviticus chapter 20, we see pretty much the same list of sexual sins that we saw in Leviticus chapter 18. And so I want to focus upon the seriousness of these sins. The land spewed the previous nations out, which is repeated here in Leviticus chapter 20. The land spewed these nations out for not just once in a while committing these sins, but for the fact that these sins became definitional and descriptive of their very lives and their very culture. And therefore, when you have these sins appearing amongst those who are to be called by the name of Yahweh, they are the covenant people of God. There is no provision provided within this context for anything other than the death penalty for these individuals. We know in a story that I would say was not original, but very, very popular in the Gospel of John, as we've discussed before in other contexts. The story that ends up in all the Jesus movies in various forms, whether it belongs there or not. But certainly that it was a popular story about the woman taken in adultery. And the background, anyways, of that story would be this text right here, that the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death. And of course, it's been mentioned many times that even in the story as it appears in later manuscripts, someone was missing. That is, the adulterer. Only the adulteress appears in that particular story. But one of the concepts that I want to make sure we understand is, did you notice the repetition of a particular phrase? Now, you have different ways of saying it. They shall bear their guilt is one way. But then there is a phrase that I'm afraid, especially in our modern day where a lot of us don't read a lot of older books, as we probably should, the phrase blood guiltiness appears. So, for example, in verse 11, if there is a man who lies with his father's wife, he has uncovered his father's nakedness, both of them shall surely be put to death. Their blood guiltiness is upon them. Verse 12, where you have, when it says they have committed incest, the actual Hebrew term there is the same term that was used back in Leviticus 18 in talking about bestiality. It's the term tevel, which means confusion. It is a sort of a subterm of the term toeva, abomination, but that has an emphasis upon the idea of the violation of proper and appropriate natural categories. And so it says they have committed an act of confusion, an act of violating boundaries, or in this case, it is then translated in some translations as incest. And what comes immediately thereafter? Their blood guiltiness is upon them. And even in verse 13, which we're going to have to spend some time on for the obvious reason that it is, if we're not quoting it, it may be being quoted to us these days. In speaking of homosexuality, after saying they shall surely be put to death, their blood guiltiness is upon them. Now, that term is not exactly a term that we utilize in everyday conversation with one another. And so we need to be careful that, especially as we're addressing this subject, if we quote a verse, or if they even quote a verse to us, do they understand what the background of that term is? We may be somewhat more comfortable using the terminology, but do we even understand what it means when it says their blood guiltiness is upon them? What is blood guilt? Well, You may recall that last Lord's Day, in the Old Testament reading, there was a discussion of the sanctuary cities, and it comes up at a couple of different places in the Old Testament reading. And if you've read through, if you've been listening on Sunday evenings as we read through the Old Testament, you start getting the idea that there was this person called an avenger. And he was to avenge the death of a member of the family or of the clan or of the tribe. And certainly in our day, the idea of the connectedness of family, clan, tribe is completely gone. I mean, I suppose there are some sports analogies in certain cities. If you live in Green Bay, Wisconsin, there's almost a tribe there. Okay. If you live in Auburn, there is a tribe there. Okay. It's only exists during college football season, but it exists. Trust me. Dallas, Texas, whatever else it might be. Here in Phoenix, this is the farthest thing from our understanding of things, because most people in Phoenix just, there's so much transition. Maybe you live in a neighborhood where there's a little more stability, but I certainly don't. People go in and out of houses so fast that you hardly even know who's who anymore. And so the idea of, and now today our families are so spread out, people move away from home. There's so much more mobility. You have to remember that for the vast majority of human experience, people did not move more than 7 to 15 miles. During the medieval period, it was only about 7 miles any one direction from where they were born their entire life. Their whole world was circumscribed by that relatively small circle. And so that meant you knew your family, you knew everybody in your family, and there would be very strong family ties. And especially in the ancient world, in the Semitic world, you would have these tribes. And these tribes had fierce loyalty to one another and these tremendously tight connections, so that if one of them was killed, there was a debt on the part of the members of their tribe, of their clan, to avenge the death. It was considered part of the justice system when there were not strong central